The Sands Hotel stood like a glittering monument to excess on the Las Vegas Strip on the night of November 3, 1955. It wasn't just a hotel, it was a temple of American glamour in the middle of the Nevada desert, where old money and new money collided under crystal chandeliers that cast dancing light across mahogany and marble. The showroom was packed beyond capacity. Every table was occupied, every seat was taken. Even the standing room had people pressed shoulder to shoulder, nursing cocktails that cost more than most people made in a week. All waiting for one of the greatest entertainers alive to take the stage. Dean Martin was in his prime. At 38 years old, he was at the absolute peak of his powers, a man who could sing like an angel, deliver a joke like a philosopher, and command a room with nothing more than a glance and a smile. He'd built a reputation as the cool, sophisticated crooner, the kind of man who made everything look effortless, who could seduce an entire audience with nothing but his voice and his presence. The orchestra had already begun warming up. The lighting designer was testing the spotlights, casting dramatic shadows across the empty stage. The waiters moved silently through the crowd, delivering drinks with practiced precision, their white jackets precision, their faces professionally blank. In the back of the showroom, the casino floor was visible through the large arched doorway, the constant gentle roar of slot machines, the sharp sound of chips being raked across felt tables, the occasional celebratory shout of someone hitting a jackpot. It was a November night, but inside the Sands, it was always summer. The air conditioning hummed. The temperature was perfect. Time operated differently here. Outside the hotel, the desert was cool and dark, but in here, it was a perpetual golden hour. Frozen in 1955, in a moment when Vegas was becoming something new, a place where organized crime and entertainment, danger and glamour, all existed in an uneasy but profitable partnership. The audience was a mix of high rollers, entertainment industry people, socialites, and wealthy tourists who'd come to Vegas looking for a taste of danger and excitement. The women wore elaborate evening gowns. The men wore tailored suits. Everyone was dressed like they were attending a formal dinner at the finest restaurant in the world. Except they were sitting at small round tables in a showroom that smelled of cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and whiskey. At approximately 9:47 p.m., the door at the back of the showroom opened, not the main entrance, a side entrance, the kind usually reserved for staff and performers. Anthony Big Tony Castellano walked through that door like he owned the place. In a sense, he did. He was a capo in the New York crime family, which meant he had ties to every major casino in Las Vegas. He was one of the men who understood that Vegas didn't run on luck, it ran on money and power. And those two things were interchangeable if you knew how to move them around. Big Tony was loud, not in volume alone, although he was certainly loud in that way, too. His voice carried across the showroom like a foghorn. But he was loud in presence. He was crude. He wore a suit that probably cost $2,000, but he wore it like a gangster, not like a gentleman. His shirt was open at the collar, revealing a heavy gold chain. His rings caught the light as he moved. His hair was slicked back with pomade. He was drunk, and he wanted everyone in the room to know he was there. He wasn't there to watch Dean Martin perform. He was there to remind everyone that he existed, that he had power, that he could walk into any room in Vegas at any time and assert dominance simply by being present. He had 3 men with him, Misul, the kind of men who looked like they'd been carved from granite and dressed in suits to make them look civilized. They stayed behind him, giving him space to operate, ready to move if he needed them to move. Big Tony found a table near the front, close to the stage, and sat down without waiting to be seated. A waiter immediately appeared, sensing the kind of customer who wouldn't tolerate any delay in his service. "Scotch?" Big Tony said. "Top shelf. And don't bring me that watered-down garbage you serve 2 tourists." The waiter nodded and disappeared. Big Tony lit a cigarette without asking if it bothered anyone, though, of course, in 1955, nobody would have dared object even if it did. At 9:52 p.m., the lights in the showroom began to dim. The orchestra struck the opening notes of Dean Martin's theme music. The audience applauded, the curtain began to rise, and then Dean Martin walked out onto that stage. And for a moment, just a moment, the entire room held its breath. He was beautiful in the way that only people who've dedicated their lives to mastering their craft can be beautiful. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that fit him like it had been painted onto his body. His hair was styled to perfection. His smile was the smile of a man who'd learned that confidence was the most attractive thing in the world. He walked to the microphone with the casual grace of a man who belonged there, who'd performed on stages so many times that the stage itself had become an extension of his consciousness. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice warm and intimate despite the size of the room. "Welcome to the Sands. I'm Dean Martin, and I'm delighted to be here with you tonight." The audience applauded. It was a warm reception, genuine and enthusiastic. Dean began his set with a song that was perfectly chosen, something classic, something that would settle the audience into a state of relaxation and pleasure. His voice was extraordinary. It had a richness to it that made even people who didn't consider themselves music lovers sit up and pay attention. He was 3 songs into his set when Big Tony's presence began to make itself felt in ways that went beyond his physical location in the room. Dean was in the middle of a beautiful ballad, a song about love and loss, about the way the human heart could contain so much emotion and still keep beating. He was doing what he did best, connecting with the audience on an emotional level, making them feel less alone in the world, making them believe for just a moment that their own heartaches and joys mattered in the grand scheme of things. The orchestra was playing softly. The room was silent except for Dean's voice, and then Big Tony's voice cut through the moment like a knife through silk. "Hey Dean," he shouted, his voice harsh and drunk. "Sing something with some life in it. My grandmother could put more energy into a song and she's been dead for 10 years. The audience froze. They knew immediately what had happened. A line had been crossed. This wasn't gentle heckling from someone who'd had too much to drink and was trying to be funny. This was a deliberate intrusion, a deliberate attempt to disrupt the show and draw attention to the heckler's presence. The other patrons looked at each other with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to fear. Nobody heckled Dean Martin, nobody interrupted the show. That wasn't how things worked at the Sands, or anywhere else in Vegas for that matter. Dean stopped singing. The orchestra stopped playing. He turned slowly to look at Big Tony, and for just a moment, his face was unreadable. Then, he smiled. It was the smile of a man who dealt with difficult situations before, who understood that in a room full of people, how you responded to a challenge mattered far more than the challenge itself. "Well, sir," Dean said, his voice calm and friendly, "if your grandmother sings as well as you behave, I'd love to hear her sometime." The audience laughed. It was relieved laughter. The tension broke. Dean had done something remarkable. He'd acknowledged the heckler, made a joke, and maintained control of the room all at once. He'd shown that he wasn't afraid, that he wasn't angry, that he had the skill and the composure to handle the situation with grace. "Thank you for that input," Dean continued, turning back to face the audience. "Now, where was I?" He returned to his song as if the interruption had never happened. The orchestra picked up where it had left off. The audience settled back into their seats, grateful that Dean had diffused the situation so skillfully. Big Tony settled back too, but his face showed no sign of contrition. He'd made his presence felt, he'd tested the waters, and he wasn't done. 20 minutes passed. Dean had finished the ballad and moved into his set with a different kind of energy. He was telling stories now, which was one of his great gifts. He could tell a story with the same skill that he could sing a song, building tension, releasing it, making his audience lean forward in anticipation. He was telling a story about growing up in Steubenville, Ohio, a small town story, the kind of story that made him human to the audience, that stripped away the glamour and reminded them that beneath the tuxedo and the perfect hair and the magnificent voice was a man with a mother, with a childhood, with experiences that shaped who he'd become. "My mother was an extraordinary woman," Dean said, his voice warm with genuine affection. "Her name was Angela Crocetti. She came to this country from Italy when she was 17 years old. She didn't speak English. She didn't have any money. She didn't have anything except her character and her values." The room was quiet. This was the kind of story that made people think of their own mothers, their own parents, the people who'd shaped them into who they were. "She taught me something that I've carried with me my entire life," Dean continued. "She taught me to always be polite, always respect others, always conduct myself with dignity." She said, "Dino, the way you treat people when you have power over them tells you everything about who you really are." Dean smiled, remembering. The audience was with him completely. Even Big Tony had stopped talking, though his expression remained contemptuous. "She cleaned houses for rich people," Dean said. She scrubbed their floors, she washed their clothes, she cooked their meals. Some of those people treated her with respect. They said please and thank you. They saw her as a human being. But some of them treated her like she was invisible. The story was powerful because it was true, because it came from a real place in Dean's heart. The audience could feel it. That's when Big Tony stood up. His voice boomed across the showroom, silencing everyone else, silencing the orchestra, silencing even the sound of the casino floor beyond the arched doorway. "Dean," he shouted, "your mother taught you manners. Shame she didn't teach you how Vegas really works." The room went absolutely silent. Every person there understood what had just happened. Big Tony hadn't just heckled again. That would have been rude, but it would have been within the bounds of acceptability for a drunk man in a casino. He'd insulted Dean's mother. He'd done it deliberately. He'd done it in a way that was designed to hurt, to humiliate, to show everyone in the room that Big Tony had the power to insult anyone he wanted, even the guest of honor, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. And worse, she'd done it by mocking the memory of a woman who was dead. A woman who'd shaped Dean's entire life. A woman who was sacred to him in a way that only your mother can be sacred. In Italian culture especially, but really in any culture, in any moral framework. Insulting someone's mother was crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. It was primal. It was personal. It was the kind of thing that in another era, in another place, might have resulted in violence. The band stopped playing. The spotlight operator didn't know where to point the light. The audience held its breath because everyone in that showroom understood that they were watching a moment that could change everything. Dean Martin had two choices. He could ignore it and look weak. He could pretend the insult hadn't landed, that it didn't matter, that Big Tony wasn't worth his attention. But everyone in that room would know it was a performance, would know that he'd been hurt, would know that he'd backed down. Or he could respond. He could stand up to a mobster, he could fight back, but that could mean starting a war with a man who had the power to end his career in Vegas with a single phone call. Dean stood at the microphone perfectly still. The spotlight found him again, isolating him in light while the rest of the room faded into darkness. He wasn't smiling anymore, but he wasn't angry either. His face was calm, contemplative. He looked like a man who was accessing something deep within himself. Some reservoir of strength and wisdom that he'd need to draw from. He took a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, not weak, quiet. But somehow that quiet voice reached every corner of the room, reached the back tables, reached the bar, reached even the casino floor beyond the doorway. "Sir," Dean said, "I want to thank you for bringing up my mother." The room was confused. What was he doing? Why was he thanking Big Tony? "Because she's actually the perfect example of what I'm trying to explain," Dean continued. Big Tony smirked. He thought he'd won. His crew laughed, their laughter harsh and triumphant. They thought their boss had dominated the situation, had put this pretty singer in his place. But Dean wasn't done. "My mother came to this country from Italy when she was 17 years old," Dean said, his voice still calm, still measured. "She didn't speak English, she had no money. She had nothing except her character and her values." He paused, letting that sink in. "And, you know what?" Dean continued. "She taught me. She taught me that the way you treat people when you have power over them tells you everything about who you really are. Not what you say about yourself. Not what kind of car you drive or what kind of suit you wear. But how you treat people when you have the power to treat them badly and you choose not to." The room was completely silent now. Dean's voice remained calm, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath it. The steel of conviction. The steel of someone who was speaking from a place of absolute truth. "My mother cleaned houses for rich people," Dean said. "She scrubbed their floors. She washed their clothes. She cooked their meals. Some of those people, the ones who understood what real class really is, they treated her with respect. They said please and thank you. They saw her as a human being who was working hard to feed her family." Dean paused, his eyes found Big Tony in the darkness. "But some of them," Dean said slowly, "treated her like she was invisible, like she was nothing. Like being poor and working with your hands meant you didn't deserve basic human dignity. Like cleaning someone else's house somehow made you less of a person." Big Tony's smirk was fading. He could sense where this was going. The audience was leaning forward. Even the waiters had stopped moving. "And you know what my mother told me?" Dean asked. His voice didn't raise, didn't become theatrical, it became more intimate, more personal. She said, Dino, the people who are cruel when they have power are the weakest people in the world, because they need power to feel strong. They need to make others feel small so they can feel big. They have nothing else. Dean's eyes were locked on Big Tony now. The two men were connected across the darkness of the showroom by nothing but the force of Dean's words. Now, she said, real strength is being kind when you could be cruel, Dean continued. Real power is lifting people up, not tearing them down. Real confidence doesn't need to humiliate others. Real confidence doesn't need an audience's fear. It needs something much simpler. It needs respect, the kind of respect you earn by how you treat people when you have power over them. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This wasn't a performance. This was something deeper. This was a man speaking truth about what mattered in life. What separated the strong from the weak? What separated people who'd earned their dignity from people who were just bullying others into submission? So, when you make a joke about my mother, Dean said, his voice still calm, still measured, you're actually proving exactly what she taught me. You're showing everyone in this room that you need to insult a dead woman to feel powerful. You need to mock someone's mother to get attention. You need to make someone else small so you can feel big. Dean took a step forward on the stage, and, sir, he said, his voice like a quiet bell, that doesn't make you look strong, that makes you look desperate. Big Tony's face was red now, his jaw was clenched, his crew had stopped laughing. People at the surrounding tables were looking at him with expressions that ranged from pity to disgust to something deeper, a kind of recognition that this man had just been shown exactly who he was, and it wasn't pretty. You said my mother should have taught me how Vegas really works, Dean continued, his voice never wavering. Let me tell you how Vegas really works. Vegas runs on money. Sure, Vegas runs on power. Absolutely. But you know what makes Vegas actually function? What makes it work day after day? He paused, and the silence was deafening. It's the dealers and the waitresses and the janitors and the performers, Dean said. It's the people who show up every day and do their jobs with dignity. It's the people who treat others with respect even when they're not being respected in return. It's the people who understand that real strength isn't about dominating others. It's about lifting yourself up through your character, through your integrity, through the way you conduct yourself in the world. Dean took another step forward. My mother understood something that you clearly don't, he said. Power without character is just bullying. Money without decency is just greed. And making jokes about someone's mother doesn't make you clever or funny or powerful. It makes you small. It makes you weak. It makes you look like exactly what you are, a man who needs to hurt others to feel important. The silence in the room was absolute. Dean had just called out a mobster publicly, thoroughly, devastatingly. Without raising his voice, without cursing, without threatening. He'd simply held up a mirror and shown Big Tony exactly what he was, and the reflection was devastating because it was true. So here's what I'm going to do, Dean said, his voice taking on a quality of absolute resolution. I'm going to continue with my show. I'm going to honor my mother's memory by treating everyone in this room, including you, with the respect and dignity she taught me, even when they don't deserve it, even when they've disrespected her. Because that's what real strength looks like. That's what real class looks like. He turned his gaze directly to Big Tony, and that's how Vegas really works, when you understand what actually matters. Dean turned to the band. Let's pick it up with something cheerful. How about That's Amore? The music started, the lights shifted, Dean began to sing, his voice perfect, his timing flawless, and Big Tony sat there visibly shaken as the entire room watched him. He'd come into this showroom to assert his dominance, to remind everyone of his power, to put Dean Martin in his place. Instead, he'd been made to look like exactly what he was, a bully who needed to hurt others to feel important, whose power was nothing compared to the power of truth, spoken with calm strength. After the show ended, Dean gave a stunning performance. Every song perfect. Every moment of his presence on stage, a statement about what he'd said earlier. He was in his dressing room when there was a knock on the door. It was one of Big Tony's associates, a man named Sal, a big man, the kind of man who looked like he could hurt people without much effort. Mr. Martin, Sal said, his voice neutral. Big Tony wants to speak with you. He's waiting outside. Dean's manager, who was standing nearby, immediately went pale. Dean, don't go, he said, his voice rising. Let me call security. This is dangerous. You don't know what he might do. Dean put his hand on the manager's shoulder. It's okay, he said calmly. I'll talk to him. Dean, his manager started. It's okay, Dean repeated. Sometimes you have to finish a conversation face to face. Dean walked out of the dressing room, through the backstage area, and out into the parking lot. The cool November air hit his face. The desert night was clear. The stars were visible above, away from the lights of the casino. Big Tony was leaning against a Cadillac, smoking a cigarette. His crew was there, 3 men in dark suits, but they kept their distance. Standing back near another car, giving Big Tony space to talk to Dean alone, Dean approached slowly, with no fear in his bearing. He wasn't trying to look brave, he was just being himself. Big Tony looked at Dean for a long moment without speaking, just smoking his cigarette, his face unreadable, his eyes cold. Then he spoke. You made me look like an asshole in there, Big Tony said. Dean didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. You made yourself look like an asshole, Dean replied evenly. I just pointed it out. For a moment, it seemed like violence might happen. Big Tony's hand clenched. His jaw tightened. The men standing back got a little closer, ready to move if their boss needed them. But then Big Tony took a drag on his cigarette. He exhaled slowly. He laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. You know, I could make things very difficult for you in this town, Big Tony said. His voice was calm now, but it was the calmness of someone stating a fact. I could make one phone call. I could make sure you never work in Vegas again. I could end your career with a single conversation. I know, Dean said. His voice was quiet but steady. You have that power. I'm not going to pretend you don't. You could destroy me professionally, and we both know it. You could make sure that no major casino in this city will book me. You could make my career in Vegas impossible. So why did you do it? Big Tony asked. There was genuine confusion in his voice, genuine curiosity. This was a man trying to understand something that didn't fit into his worldview. Why risk everything to defend your dead mother's honor? She's gone, Dean. She's not coming back. Why throw away your career for her memory? Dean chooses principle over safety after a mobster publicly insults his mother, calmly explaining that some things matter more than career, money, or power. His response isn't about anger or revenge, but about honoring his mother's memory and staying true to who he is. Later, Big Tony confronts Dean privately. Instead of threatening him, Tony reveals his own past, a loving mother whose lessons about strength and decency he abandoned as he gained power. Dean's words on stage remind Tony of those forgotten values. Though Tony admits he's gone too far to truly change, he acknowledges Dean's courage and apologizes in his own way, promising no further trouble. The incident spreads through Las Vegas as a powerful story not of violence or domination, but of dignity and truth. Dean becomes a symbol of a different kind of strength, inspiring other performers to stand up to intimidation without sacrificing their values. Years later, Dean explains that his choice came from understanding that insults are often tools of insecurity, and that real power lies in kindness, restraint, and lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Dean smiled thoughtfully. I don't know if I changed his mind, Dean said. People don't change their fundamental nature because of a single conversation, no matter how powerful that conversation is. But I think I reminded him of something. Something he'd learned as a child from his own mother. Something he'd chosen to forget as he got older and more involved with a certain lifestyle. And maybe that reminder made a small difference. Maybe it made him just slightly less cruel than he otherwise would have been. That's all we can really do, right? Remind people of the better versions of themselves. The interviewer included this in his article. He wrote about Dean Martin, about how he was often portrayed as the cool, detached member of the Rat Pack, the casual, sophisticated entertainer who made everything look effortless. But beneath that casual exterior, the interviewer wrote, is a man with unshakable principles, a man with a deep respect for his roots, a man with the courage to speak truth, even to dangerous men, a man whose mother would be immensely proud of who he became. When Dean Martin died in 1995, at the age of 78, his daughter Diana was going through his possessions. She was looking through his private papers, the things he kept in his study, the things that mattered to him most. She found a small wooden box, old and worn, the kind of box that had been carried and cherished for decades. Inside the box was a single photograph: Dean's mother, Angela, when she was young, her face full of warmth and strength, and the kind of beauty that came from having a good soul. Next to the photograph was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, fragile with handling. It was handwritten, in Italian, in a woman's careful script. Diana had the letter translated. It read, "Dino, always remember, being strong doesn't mean being hard. Being powerful doesn't mean being cruel. The strongest people are those who are kind when they could be mean, gentle when they could be harsh, kind when they could be vicious. That is true strength, Dino. That is what I want you to be. That is what I am trying to teach you with every moment we share. Your strength doesn't come from your fists or your voice or the power you accumulate. It comes from your character. It comes from the choices you make when no one is watching. It comes from how you treat people who can do nothing for you. That is where real strength lives. Remember this always." Your mother, Angela, Dean, had carried this note for his entire life. 70 years, nearly 8 decades of carrying it. He'd kept it with him through his entire career, through his marriage and his affairs, through his success and his struggles, through his rise to stardom and his complex relationships with the other members of the Rat Pack. He'd kept it with him on that November night in 1955 when he stood on the stage at the Sands and spoke truth to power. Somehow, in some way that Diana would never fully understand, that note had guided every decision he'd made that mattered. It had shaped how he responded to Big Tony that night. It had shaped how he treated people throughout his career. It was his mother's final lesson, and he'd honored it every single day of his life. Diana wept when she read the letter. She understood, in that moment, how much her father had loved his mother, how much he'd loved the values she'd taught him, how much he'd tried to live by those values in a world that often rewarded cruelty and ambition and dominance above all else. She kept the letter and the photograph. She showed it to people she trusted. And slowly, the real story of Dean Martin began to emerge, not just the story of the entertainer, not just the story of the member of the Rat Pack, but the story of a man who'd spent his entire life trying to honor his mother's memory, trying to be the kind of person she'd taught him to be. Big Tony Castellano died in 1972. He was 67 years old. According to people who knew him in his final years, he'd mellowed considerably. He was never a good man. He'd done too many terrible things for that. He'd hurt people, he'd destroyed lives, he'd made choices that could never be undone. But in his later years, he'd become less cruel, less needlessly vicious, less quick to inflict pain for the sake of asserting dominance. When people asked him about the change, he'd sometimes tell them about something he'd heard once, something that had stuck with him. He'd say, "I heard something once that never left me. About how treating people badly when you have power over them is just weakness pretending to be strengths. Took me too long to understand it, but I understand it now." He never mentioned Dean Martin by name, but those who knew the story understood exactly what he meant. Those who knew Big Tony well said that in his final months, dying in a hospital bed, he sometimes spoke about that November night in 1955 when Dean Martin held up a mirror to his soul. When a mafia boss insulted Martin's mother on stage, the singer could have reacted with anger, violence, or retaliation. Instead, he chose calm and truth, responding to cruelty with clarity and demonstrating the lesson his mother had taught him about real strength. That moment changed something in Big Tony. Though he never became a good man, he became less cruel, learning the difference between dominance and real authority. One man's choice to respond with integrity and dignity, speaking without fear, but also without arrogance. Showing compassion without humiliation planted seeds that shaped the rest of Big Tony's life. The story spread from Vegas through the entertainment industry and reached ordinary people dealing with bullies in their own lives. It reminded them that there's a better way to handle conflict, that you don't have to meet cruelty with cruelty. 70 years later, people still tell this story because it proves that change is possible, that defending what matters doesn't require violence, and that real strength comes from living according to your values even when it costs you something. Dean Martin proved that true power is lifting people up instead of tearing them down. And that's the most powerful thing anyone can ever do.